Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Morris. I'm a professor here at Saïd Business School in the University of Oxford. Today we're going to talk about how can you create impact when leading through transformational change. I'm joined by two of the previous participants on the OAMLP. Joseph Bruchscholl, who is Chief Executive of Quack Telekom in Austria, and Rebecca Oldfield, who is the Global Sales Executive for Infinium Limited here in the UK. We're also going to be joined, we hope, if we can get the connection up, with a third previous participant, Amelie Schnarr-Campbell, who is Head of Financial Impact and Strategy at Standard Bank in South Africa. So welcome to everybody who is joining us today. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope that you find this session both enjoyable, stimulating, and something that tells you more about the program itself. The way we're going to work is that I'm just going to talk through 4 or 5 slides which are primarily about leadership, and then we're going to get more to the change element of the session, and that's where we'll engage, if we can, with my colleagues here, and we'll take your questions and answer them as they're coming through. So my talk is simply here primarily to get us thinking and hopefully to provoke you into thinking a little bit about things which you should be familiar with already, but hopefully will get you thinking a little bit more deeply. Okay, so the first one is we're going to talk about leadership, as I said, and on this first slide you have a picture of a man called Peter Drucker, who many of you will probably know was, I think, one of the first management gurus, and in my book, the very best. And 2 quotes which are really trying to answer the question, do leaders make a difference? Here's Drucker talking in 1967, that's what, 50 years ago, and he's making a statement that says the quality and performance of the leader determines the success of the business. Indeed, they determine its survival. So he's making a very strong statement there about how much impact leaders have on an organization, and clearly that's a theme for us today. On the other hand, you have 2 eminent scholars, one of whom was in fact a Nobel Prize winner, and they're taking a rather different view, as they say. A leader is like the driver of a skidding car. If he receives a medal for heroism or a manslaughter charge, is largely outside his control. In other words, what they're saying is basically leaders very, very rarely make a big difference because life is outside of their control. So what I wanted you to do there is not to say, well, one's right, one's wrong, but to get you thinking about how do we know what difference leaders make? And it's important because what frames this session is an interest in leadership, and it's something which nearly everybody these days, you don't have to be studying leadership, but you find nearly everybody has got a view about the importance of leadership or not. And perhaps that's due to political leaders that we've seen coming and going in recent years. Perhaps it's due to things like the interest in chief executives, what they do they earn their money, why they're successful or not. Or more generally, I think we have an interest in the idea that leaders make a huge difference to organizations. In other words, the Drucker type of argument. So that gets us going. Do leaders make a difference? I think the tendency we have is to assume that they do, and therefore that's why we take so much notice of them. But in a way, the more interesting question is actually, if we believe they do make a difference, we've got to ask ourselves the question then, how do leaders make a difference to performance? And I put that slide up there primarily for 2 reasons. First of all, the how question. If we're going to have an argument or make the assumption that leaders do make a difference, then we have to think clearly about how exactly do they make a difference in an organization. Many of you, I'm sure, will work for very large organizations, and you could say, well, how on earth can the chief executive, for example, at the top of an organization, how on earth can he or she actually make much difference on a day-to-day basis? How do they have an impact upon their own organisation, never mind the rest of the world? So we've got to have, as it were, an internal model in our heads about how leaders might make a difference. And I'd like you to think about that, and that's certainly something I would come back to on the programme. The second one in particular is this word performance, because if you think about it, what we've got here is leaders and performance. And the challenge is really to say, what is it that leaders actually do or say, or how they act or behave or they think? What is it that they do that actually can make a difference to the performance of a large organisation? We might say, well, look, they can make a difference to the team immediately around them. The question, and we can talk about that, the question is also about how do they make an impact more widely across an organisation? And to provoke your thinking here, what I've done is put a picture up there, as you can see, of an orchestra conductor. And that's a sort of extreme example to the layperson where you might be asking, how on earth is that person making any difference at all by waving that baton around in what looks like a relatively random way? To the outsider, to the layperson, you might be thinking, I could do that, but it appears that anybody in that orchestra will tell you, well, they are making a difference to what we are doing, even though they'll have practiced that performance many, many times. So there's a sort of mystery wrapped up in this idea of leaders making a difference to performance, and to unpack that, we have to have a model or models inside our heads which we carry around with us and put into practice, which says, this is how I, as a leader, can actually make a difference to performance. We'll come back to that, I hope, again in the questions. On this slide here, we have a classic picture of a famous leader, which we'll come to in a minute. But what I've done here is to help you through this by putting up a number of different types of definitions. And as I've said there in the title of the slide, leadership tends to be associated with people. Leaders lead people. There are people involved in the process of leadership, usually leaders and followers. Secondly, leadership is not just a rational activity. It is not just something that happens through, as it were, cognition. It involves emotion as well. In other words, the leadership effectiveness point, how do they make a difference to performance, what is leadership about, clearly has an emotional angle to it. In other words, we commit to leaders. We want to do what they say. We find them effective because they're able to fire up or somehow connect to our own emotions. And then that third word, persuasion. Something about what they do gets us to follow them. So they're persuading us to do, as it were, what they want. So that leads us into the definitions. The first one, the process through which leaders influence the attitudes, behaviours and values of others towards a goal, is an absolutely standard textbook definition of leadership. Notice 3 or 4 key words there. Process. Leadership is a process. It isn't just a one-off event. It doesn't just happen on Tuesday afternoons. Leadership is happening all the time. Secondly, leaders influence. They influence others. They get them to do things indirectly by influence as well as by direction. Thirdly, what do? They influence our attitudes. That's what's going on in our heads. They influence our behaviours, what we actually do. They influence our values. You could say that's your heart. So heads, actions, hands and heart towards a particular goal. So it's not just aimless. So leadership is summed up very well in that quote. Second one, the process of creating a vision and translating it into reality. I put that there actually because the vision word is obviously very, very popular. And it's to do with the way in which leaders obviously influence. How do they influence? They create a vision of the future. But secondly, as Kotler says here, there's no point in having a vision unless you can actually make it real for people. So the impact that leaders have is to do with painting a picture, a vision, and then turning that into reality with those around them. Thirdly, a different type of definition here. which is much more contemporary and is distinctive in the sense that it's about leadership not from the front, but almost leadership from behind. A leader here who in certain circumstances is simply creating the conditions for people to do well. It's not about directing. It's not about taking the lead from the front. It's not about, as it were, the classic definition of the heroic leader. It's about somebody who's clearing the ground and saying, as long as things don't get in the way, and that's my job, to clear the ground, you can then get on with the things that you're already very good at. Many contemporary organizations tend to take a view of leadership that looks like that as well. And then finally, this quote is a bit of an awkward sentence, but the reason I put that there is because it brings us right down to what leadership is and does on a sort of hour by hour, day by day basis. And the critical bit is the bit that I've put into italics, where leadership is exercised when ideas expressed in talk or action. The critical phrase here is, what do leaders do? They do talk, and they mold people's behaviors by what they do themselves. So when we ask how do leaders have impact and how do they make a difference, this sort of research says it's actually what you say and what you do. So if you're not talking to people and if you're not trying to be a role model in how you behave, then you're not leading. So that's a long way from the big visionary picture. And then finally take a look at that picture itself. The reason I put that there is we could talk a lot more about this, but it's a well-composed picture. It's a very famous portrait, obviously, of Napoleon. And I'd like you to just think a bit about what is it about that picture that tells you Napoleon is an heroic leader. There are many, many clues in that picture, but the point is we are hardwired as people, as humans, we are hardwired to recognize leadership when we see it in others. In other words, right from the point of evolution into human groups, we have recognized leadership as some way in which we can get things done. And that's why it is partly why, one of the reasons why it is so powerful for everybody in the world. Now, what do we know about leadership? I'm just going to give you a taste of this here by just talking about a particular way of thinking about it through styles. In other words, how do leaders connect with followers? So what I'm talking about here is a relationship, which is really important. Leaders aren't leaders unless they've got followers. And two very, very common ways of thinking about different styles of leadership, again, these are universal categories, is to say, well, we can separate the idea of a style into a directive model, tough leadership as it's called, and you can see the sort of characteristics of that. It speaks for itself. A directive leader, give me direction, show me the way, show me what you want to do, and a more empowering model of leadership. And generally, we can think a bit about these as two distinct styles. Now, the general argument is, though, that people tend to say, well, I cluster towards one more than the other. In other words, naturally, I feel more like an empowering leader or a directive leader. Ask yourself which one you think you are personally more inclined towards. There's been a lot of research that actually suggests that empowering tends to be superior over the long run in terms of performance. But what I would qualify that by saying is actually what appears to work best, interestingly, coming out of recent research, is a combination of both directive and empowering. In other words, you need some flexibility in your style. The evidence suggests pretty clearly across lots of different countries, lots of different types of industries and conditions, that it is not empowering on its own that actually works best. It's a combination of directive and empowering which leads to superior performance. So we're answering the question, how do leaders make a difference to performance there? And then finally, I like to summarize what leadership is all about by focusing down on 4 core areas of action. What do leaders do, or their behaviors? And hopefully this will lead us into talking more broadly about leadership and change. I summarize it like this. So this is a model which I develop and I use a lot both when I'm working with leaders in practice, but also when I'm working in the classroom. First of all, giving direction, providing vision and direction. So leadership is about being future-oriented. And as we've seen already, it's about painting a picture of where we are trying to go, giving some sense of purpose to people. And clearly what that does is, as it says on the top left, gives meaning, shows the leader's strategic ability, and is also about motivating. Secondly, if you want to take people with you and don't have to drag them there, basically, we know that leaders have to build trust and confidence with their followers. So ask yourself, how do you build trust and confidence with others around you? In other words, how do you engage them? Clues to that around communication, about being consistent with people, about the linking of saying and doing, and obviously what it says there, delegating some responsibility. Third point, choosing, making and enacting decisions. The work I've done with colleagues, with chief executives around the world, brings this home very, very dramatically to me. When you ask chief executives, well, what's the core of your job? They nearly always talk about making decisions. Unsurprisingly, what do we employ leaders to do? In the end, we ask them to make choices. That's part of your day-to-day jobs. And what I tend to say to people is, if you want to be a good leader, then learn how to make excellent decisions. Of course, we make mistakes. Of course, we have errors. Of course, none of us are perfect. All of us have our blind spots and our weaknesses. The issue is as much about understanding where your weaknesses are as developing your strengths, particularly in the area of decision making. And then finally, you can't do this all on your own. As it says down in the bottom right-hand corner, you need connections. You need political skills. You need the ability not just to be rational, but also to understand how to gain the resources and support and coalitions, how to manage the politics of organizations. And that's to do with connecting with the right people, both inside your organization and outside it. And the evidence suggests the more senior you become, the more important it is to have a great network outside your organization as much as inside it. Indeed, coming back to the work we've done with chief executives, they talk more and more about the importance of understanding and being able to connect with a wide range of stakeholders, not just shareholders, but a wide range of stakeholders. If we have more time, I'll tell you about that picture, but come on the program and we'll maybe uncover what that's all about in due course. But what I hope I've done there is just to give you some provocation, some ideas about what leadership is about. And now what I'd like us to do is open up to the Q&A. So it's your turn for us to start the dialogue off. And I'm going to bring in particular my colleagues here, Joseph and Rebecca, because you want to hear from the practitioners as much as you want to hear from me. So we'll make a start. So,
Joseph, can you hear us?
I hear her properly. Hello.
Hello. Thank you. What was your point?
On what?
On Tim's conversation so far. Do you have anything you would like to add?
So far, no. I fully agree with Tim, especially on the last slide when it comes to shaping, connecting, choosing, and engaging. I think what we have to understand is, especially when it comes to change and leadership, that we as leaders are not alone, and at the end of the day, our accomplishments are driven by the support of many others. I think Tim's last point, in terms of the more senior you get, the more important relationship-based behavior becomes, is a very important point.
Rebecca. What's your thoughts on that?
Hello, sorry, I was on mute there. You told me I would fall into that trap.
It's a very easy trap to fall into, don't worry.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would add to what Tim has said so far, just to say I think one thing I can attest is the fact that in a leadership role, it's almost impossible to avoid change. Change is typically happening all around us, whether that's internal change that's driven by changes in your own organisation. A lot of the time, change comes from external stimuli, from what's happening in your industry, what your competitors are doing, what your shareholders are asking for, etc. So change is a really critical part of leadership, and Tim's given us some great ideas here about how to manage change, and in fact on the course it's a key part of the learning during the 3-week programme. I think what is often interesting to think about is what can derail you when you're trying to implement change, drive forward change in an organisation. And Joseph just mentioned the word alignment, and I think that probably sums it up quite nicely. I mean, typically, the change itself can be very clear to those people who are in a position to understand the strategic direction of the organisation, the driver for change, etc. But the real challenge is to make that meaningful for everyone in the organisation. So using perhaps the conductor analogy as an example, if the conductor feels that the tempo of the piece needs to increase or decrease, the key thing is it's not enough for that person in that position, or even just for him in the violin section to know that. He or she in that position needs to communicate that to everybody to make the change successful. So I think aligning your whole organisation around the need for the change and how the change should be implemented is a really important part of making it deliver that superior performance that you're ultimately looking for.
Could both you two just expand a little bit on this point about alignment? What I'm interested in here is, how do you communicate that, Rebecca? How do you communicate what's necessary, the sort of alignment issue? What have been the challenges that you've faced, and how have you dealt with those?
I think it's the best way I can describe that is all the time. So I think another piece of information actually I picked up on the same course is the idea that if you want people to know something, you better tell them 10 times, and then eventually it starts to sink in. So I think there's an element here of constancy of purpose and engaging the people around you first, your sort of closest stakeholders first, and then relying on others, of course, to continue with the communication. Then I would say it's really important about how you behave. It's imperative, I think, that as a leader you take the advice from Gandhi, I think, as be the change that you want to see in the world. So if you are not acting in the way that you want others to act, if you are not talking about the change in the way that you wish others to understand it, then it's going to be much more difficult to convince people to move ahead with the change that you're looking for, that you think is right for your business. So I think it's about not so much what you do, but what you say and how you are. And those are the things that are critical all the time to enacting that change and making it real for people, driving it home and convincing people that this is the right thing to be doing. And eventually it sort of filters through
Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's fantastic. Joseph, do you have anything more to add to that?
No, I fully agree on Rebecca's points that creating alignment is a full-time job and maybe the most important thing a leader has to do. I think what we have to understand is that, for example, change cannot be assigned in a meeting room. So I think as a leader, you have to take any opportunity to promote the change you're aiming for. And I'm referring to Tim's slide before where he's comparing the directive and empowering way of leadership. I think especially when it comes to alignment, the combination of the two approaches is extremely important. On the one hand, I think you have to be directive in terms of keep the thin red line and the direction of the change aimed for. On the other hand, creating alignment, creating trust to achieve the vision, an empowering approach is highly important. So I think it's needed to spend a lot of time and effort as a leader in this regards, and here I fully agree. I'm totally on the same page like Rebecca here.
Thank you, Joseph. Annalie, I'm going to bring you in here as well for your thoughts, so sort of the third perspective on this particular question.
Thank you very much. I think for me, the concept of a leadership team is also very important. I think many times as a leader, you have to first believe in the purpose of yourself and the organization that you represent. But you can achieve so much more if you have a diverse group of people all working towards the same purpose and goals. And whereas it may be possible for you to get the buy-in and inspire one group of people, it may sometimes take a whole team of people with different personalities and different leadership styles to really get the whole organization behind you. So I do definitely believe as well that in addition to your own leadership ability, what we should utilize a lot is actually our team, and make sure that we actually give them the confidence that they can stand up and also take a leadership role. And as I say, that way we can really be most impactful and most effective. I think as well, the other thing that I like that Tim said in the beginning was the fact that different leadership styles are appropriate at different times. And again, I think that potentially under different conditions, different people should really step up to provide that leadership role. And that is, in my mind, that would be some of the key ways that you can get this alignment right across the group.
Brilliant. That's very helpful. Actually, that point about top teams and using the diversity of teams and diversity of styles is a really good one, because you don't have to be everything to everybody all the time. You can play with a team, and they can do the things that don't come naturally or so easily to you, I think, as well. Just a couple of points, just to refer to some interesting research that has been coming through in recent years, which very much confirms what our three colleagues here have been saying. First of all, the evidence suggests that nothing beats face-to-face communications. So if you want change to happen and people are asking questions around how do I make this happen, the evidence comes back to what you do and what you say. So get out there, don't send an email, don't send emails or rely too much on emails. You have to get out there, and increasingly the evidence suggests one-to-one conversations are the ways in which you're most likely to be able to persuade people. If they are at all resistant or disinterested, you've got to get out there and talk to them one-to-one or in small groups. And then the alternative, but is very complementary to that, is again about conversation, but it's larger group meetings, town hall meetings, all the rest. But basically, people need to see your face, and they need to see you talking about it, and they need to see you living this all the time. One other thing that you may be interested in that comes through from the research on how to sell change, as it were, is that people often talk about selling the benefits of change. and they are important indeed. But actually, the other way to frame this is to say, what would happen if you didn't change? In other words, talk about the possible loss that you would incur if you didn't go through change. The way I tend to talk about this when I'm teaching this or when I'm working with other leaders is to say, you're probably familiar with, let's say, at Christmas or a public holiday, the restaurants are trying to sell people places in their restaurant, and they'll often put a sign outside, which looks like something like, book early to avoid disappointment. I use that phrase a lot because it's a perfect example of how they're selling you the idea of you need to change. It's not about the benefit, it's about you wouldn't want to lose out. And so combining both the benefits with saying if we don't do this, these are the potential losses, is highly effective and maximizes the effect in terms of the conversation about how do you persuade people to make change happen. Right, let's move to another question if we could. There's a question which came through, which is from somebody which said, how do I start a change initiative? Who should I involve, and who should I involve at different stages of the project? But in particular, how do I get things going? I'd like to turn to our panelists and ask them for their experience in just literally, how do you get things started? What do you do? Should we start, I'll tell you what, we'll start this time, if we could, with Amelie, and maybe then take Rebecca.
Annalie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now. Tim, I think in my experience, it is always very important that you have a clear outcome that you want to achieve in your change initiative. It is very important then for you to come up with a plausible plan and what we'll call a step-by-step approach in terms of how can you achieve interim steps and interim outcomes, and how can you measure your progress toward your objective. So many times change is really complex and really hard to achieve, and if you set these smaller goals for yourself, it would be more inspiring, if you want, as well to the team with you, if they can see the outcomes being achieved as you go along. The next thing that I always tend to do is to think about who the key stakeholders are. Who is going to benefit from this change, and to make sure that I also identify the people who in themselves can play a key role in influencing this outcome. So if you're very clear in terms of why you are doing what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and who are those people in key positions who can actually help you achieve your goal, that's normally the first step on getting it done.
Excellent, thanks. How about we move to Rebecca?
Rebecca?
Hello?
Hello.
Yes. Very, very good advice from Annalie there, I must say. I would add a couple of things. First of all, I would, before you start anything, really engage your peers, trusted others in determining whether this is the right thing to do. Kick the tires on your proposal, your idea. Really challenge yourself to think about, will this change deliver the superior performance that you're looking for, or close the gap that you've identified, or bring your business to the place that you would like it to be. And as part of that discussion, think very hard about what are the alternatives. There are probably a number of different ways of achieving a particular outcome. Some of them might involve less change, some of them might be more cost effective, some of them might be quicker or a bit harder. So think about what are the alternatives, and before you home in on what is the change you are trying to drive. Annalie talked about identifying stakeholders and making sure that you bring them along with you. also add to that, think about who is likely to be most adversely impacted by the change, or even just who are likely to be the biggest resistors. And those could be people within your stakeholder group or within your organisation. And spend a little bit of time to think about how you're going to deal with that resistance ahead of starting your communication, your transformation. And I think my final piece of advice was sort of upfront work before you decide to go ahead and start a change is talked about considering who would be resistant to it and what you can deliver. But also, I think it's important to think about, can you articulate to people how to change? What they would actually have to do differently in order to make the change happen. So be careful not to have a change which is an objective without a strategy, if you like. So to give you an example, you might say, well, we need to simplify our business. And you can't just go out to an organisation and say, we're going to simplify. It's really important to be able to articulate what that actually involves doing, what each person would need to do differently in order to have a simpler, maybe lower cost or more agile organisation than you have today. So those are the pieces of advice I would give to people who are starting a change. And then I think in terms of actually starting it, we've already talked a lot about the communication part and making it feel real and achievable for the people that you are reliant upon to make it happen.
Great, excellent. Both contributors there giving really good, interesting advice here. Joseph, let's go to you, and then maybe I can summarise one or two of the thoughts I've got on this as well. Joseph, over to you.
Well, at Quark Telecom, we are in telecommunications business, and here change is going on all the time since the industry is changing all the time. So we made it a business principle that we constantly strive to anticipate the rapidly changing needs of our clients. Because if we don't do that, at the end of the day, this will lead to extinction. So the change at the end of the day comes by anticipating what does the client want from us in terms of they want their services cheaper, more convenient, easier, and to ensure the future success of the company, I think we have to adopt all the time. That means the assignment for change within our organizations primarily come from the client and not from senior management. And this makes it easy to convince people to follow the plan, to get a certain alignment, because it's always a market-driven need which makes us change. It's a great chance to communicate change in a very transparent way when you know that it's a need of the customer and you strive to fulfill this better. So this is an argument in its own.
Excellent, and that's a very nice way of putting it as well, because what you're saying is basically, why should we bother to change? Why on earth do we need to change here? And by referring to some pressure upon you from customers, typically clients or governments or regulators, then that gives you as it were, the motivation and the legitimacy to get the change moving. If I could just add one or two things there. I really like the idea of basically saying, you have to think hard about who you're going to have to persuade here and where the resistance might come from. When I've been working with a very large organization recently, and what they've tried to do is something pretty interesting in the sense that they have tried to combine what you might call the big picture, the top down, this is the rationale for change, which was very compelling because they are losing business and they're clearly nowhere near as competitive on their costs as their main competitors. So you'd think they've got a rational argument for change. So that's come through very strongly, as it were, from the top down the organisation. If we don't do this, then we are going to be in trouble. And so that gives you the big picture. But at the same time, and in parallel, what they've really worked hard to do is actually something that Rebecca was talking about, which is get right down to the shop floor, to the frontline people, and say, and by the way, this is what this means for you in practice on a day-to-day basis. So they have, for example, been trying to simplify their operations quite radically. And unless you can show people this is what we want you to do, in other words, almost have pilot studies or examples of where we need to take you on a day-to-day basis, then the risk is that the big picture stuff stays at that level. It doesn't become real. So combining that big picture top-down approach with the bottom-up, let's see how we can make this work in practice on a day-to-day basis, appears to be a good way, I think, in which you can actually get this started. Okay, let's move on if we could.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Tim. So the next question from our audience is, how does the historic culture of an organisation impact the leader in crafting the change strategy? How should he or she navigate that particular culture?
Okay, so how does the culture of the organisation impact upon the leader in crafting some sort of change, and how do you navigate through that? Rebecca, you've been dealing with cultural change. What's your thoughts about this and the impact it's had on you as a leader trying to navigate change?
Yeah, I think the key to this is to recognise that a culture that has stood the test of time probably has an awful lot of merit to it. So while it might not be exactly the right culture for the future of the business, because either external or internal things are changing, I think the thing very much to avoid here is to undermine the historical culture of your organisation and try to replace it with something new. As an alternative, I think my experience is it's better to build on the strengths of your historic culture and adapt it, evolve it, morph it, whichever words you want to use, but give people in the organisation the reassurance that you're taking all the best bits of what the company has built up with you into the future and adding on to it new elements, or looking through the same problems with a different lens, for example, to make sure that culture remains fit for the future. And one of the ways I think to do that, to take my own advice of actually suggesting how to do these things rather than just say we're going to do it. One suggestion is to protect the values of the organisation. So the values of an organisation are typically a key part of the culture, and only change the values if you really, really have to, and maybe even consider just changing a small part of them or adding to them, because that's really the cornerstone of your culture and your organisation. If you can keep the values the same, you can still adapt the culture which transcends those values, I think, by perhaps having more of a focus on agility or whatever it is, without perhaps undermining values such as respect for individuals or whatever your company's values are. So my advice there is show respect for the historic culture of the organisation and attempt to build on it and improve it rather than change it.
Thank you. That's great, Rebecca, and that's really interesting. It's a very provocative idea, actually, but very much one that I actually tend to side with, because we hear a lot about disruptors and disruptive organisations coming in and the implication is that you've got to throw everything out and start all over again. You know, get rid of the old culture, start all over again, because it's a drag on your business. The evidence actually suggests, if you look at the research, that getting rid of a culture or trying just to start all over again very rarely works, because people quite rightly ask the question, well, you know, what was wrong? What was so wrong with the old one? What was I doing that was so wrong with the old one that meant that it is now completely illegitimate? And it's very difficult for people to actually start all over again with something new. It's a much more effective change strategy to say, let's try and adapt, let's try and build from where we are, change but not throw everything out. So I like that idea, although it's not in terms of much of the some of the popular writing you hear on disruptors. Of course, it runs against that. I think it's got a lot going for it, though. Okay, let's move to another question, if we could.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tim. This is a question I'd like to put, in the interest of time, just like to put to Anna-Lee, if that's okay. So I'll just read you the question, Anna-Lee. Thinking about leadership styles, does the research show, or in your experience, have you found that styles tend to go towards one type or another, depending on the industry? So obviously you can speak from your industry in banking, Anna-Lee, and then we can perhaps seek thoughts from Joseph and Rebecca. For example, does oil and gas versus high-end IT companies behave differently? Intuitively, it seems the industry dynamics can influence the leadership style. What's your thoughts on that, Anna-Lee?
I do believe that the culture and the type of sector in which you work definitely has a significant impact in even the type of acceptable leadership style. I think if you work for a regulatory type of organization, you obviously have a very clear role that you need to play in terms of providing the constraints within which the entities in your industry have to operate. And that would definitely dictate a very specific type of outcome, which I think can be achieved most effectively through specific types of leadership styles. I do think even within a specific sector, you would still find different cultures and different types of approaches. So if you look at banks and banking organizations, for example, you do still find that there are some banking organizations which are more centralized, the decision making is made more centralized, and then you find others with more of a federal type of approach where the decision making authority and mandate is being delegated to others. So in the end, I think the type of industry does affect the type of acceptable leadership styles, but I do think almost it's the culture that would have a bigger impact. And similarly, the type of the need for rapid adaptation to change would also have an impact on the type of leadership style being affected. So if you are in an industry like Joseph was saying, where there is permanently additional requirements and changes in expectations from your stakeholders, I think that forces the type of leadership which enables extremely fast decision-making processes and the flexibility for the organization to move really quickly. And therefore, that's the type of leadership that will be adopted by those types of entities.
Thank you, Emily. That's really helpful. And what we'd like to do is move to you, Joseph, for your perspective from telecoms industry on this.
I think on the one hand, of course, you can see certain kind of leadership styles in certain industries, but this is primarily based on the matter that people tend to hire people who are similar to themselves. So it's quite easier to make a career when you fit in the picture which is requested in the industry. On the other hand, I deeply believe that when it comes to leadership style, the most important aspect is being authentic, being the person you are, because any employee can smell if you're not authentic. And so I think we talked before about disruptive management, and one of the most
That's a nice summary, I think. We can easily, I would add that you can easily stereotype these things, and I think the stereotyping can sometimes somewhat oversimplify the story. We tend to think of, for example, Silicon Valley, there must be all terribly empowered and funky. Of course, it's in other industries, maybe somebody mentioned oil and gas, you need to be much more structured and processual and so on. In practice, there may be some element of industry impact here, but basically the evidence suggests that within that, managers, leaders have the capacity to develop their own styles, and the flex between those two main styles that I showed you is the key to success here. People who can do that effectively, develop behavioral flexibility, are the ones that tend to have the highest performance. So don't feel that just because I'm in one particular industry, there is one recipe. The flexibility piece is the key to this. Okay, let's move on.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. So I'm conscious that we're running short of time, so this is probably the last question before we go to my colleague Andy, who will tell you a bit more about the Advanced Management and Leadership Programme, which Tim teaches this particular session on. So the next one, I would like to go to you, Joseph, if that's okay. So from your experience in your role, as well as when you've attended the AMLP, how do you feel that leaders can make sure change is sustainable in the long term?
Tim mentioned as one of the 4 pillars of leadership the aspect of choosing. That means you are asked to take choices, and sustainable leadership shows itself that the decisions you have taken are sustainable and can be considered right in the long run. So we have a saying, it's never give a short-term profit for a long-term goal. So what you pick as the fields of change is at the end of the day one of the most important pillars of what you do as a leader, and thereby your success is measured at the end of the day.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Joseph. Listen, we're running out of time. I'm sorry to those who've asked questions, but we haven't had time to deal with these. There's lots more we could talk about. As you can see, this is a very stimulating topic. So at this point, I'd just like to thank my 3 collaborators on this one, Joseph, Rebecca, and Annalie. You've learned a lot from their practical wisdom, I'm sure, and hopefully we've been able to answer some of your questions. But we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's fantastic. What I'll do now is I'll pass over to my colleague Andrew, who's in our team working alongside Professor Lalit Jowhary, who's the professor that leads the Advanced Management and Leadership Programme. So Andy, if I could pass over to you to tell us a little bit more about the programme and how this session forms part of it.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you, Professor Tim Morris, and our alumni panel, Joseph, Rebecca and Annalie, for what was a really insightful and rich conversation. We're very grateful for all of your inputs. So as Gemma mentioned, I look after the Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Programme. It's one of our flagship Financial Times ranked executive education open programmes. And this programme represents an opportunity to take 3 weeks away from your day-to-day in Oxford and explore how you can be most effective within your leadership role and how you can shape your organisation to be most effective within the wider society. So we begin by exploring the global context, utilising the best that the University of Oxford has to offer to examine the factors that are shaping our current and future environments and how we as leaders can prepare ourselves to meet these challenges and make the most of these opportunities. The programme then moves on to think about our organisations and what challenges and choices we face in shaping our organisations to have the greatest impact through our marketing, finance, HR and other functions within the organisational structure. Finally, we take some time to allow you to think about you. What impact do you want to have as a leader within that organisation? And what impact do you want that organisation to have in the society within which it operates? Now, change is obviously a critical factor within any organisation, and within the programme we take time to explore leading change through a number of core programme sessions, supported by peer group conversations and insight, personal coaching, and an opportunity to host a unique participant case study and gain feedback from faculty and peers on your particular change challenge. So the programme takes place twice a year, in June and October, and the next programme runs from the 4th to the 24th of June 2017. Currently convening in Oxford on the 4th of June are 35 senior leaders who between them bring expertise and experience from over 20 different countries on 6 continents and around 15 broad sectors of work. If you'd like to learn more, please do contact either myself, Andy Faulkner, or my colleague Charles Blythe, who will be delighted to discuss with you how this programme might address the development goals of yourself, but also of the organisation in more detail. Thank you for registering and attending the webinar today, and we very much hope to hear from you soon and look forward to the possibility of working with you in Oxford over the coming months.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for attending, including our panellists. It's been a really interesting discussion. We could talk about this for hours, which is fantastic. I just wanted to let everybody know the recording of the webinar, along with some books and case studies that Professor Tim Morris is going to share with myself, will be sent in the next 7 days to all of the attendees for the webinar. So you will have another chance to review the content that we've discussed today. I'll also, if you would like to speak to any of the alumni from the panel from the Advanced Management Leadership Programme, I'm sure they'll be very happy to speak to anybody that would like to know more on a personal basis of how this experience has changed their leadership approach, particularly around change, but not excluding any other topics. Please do let us know. We'll be very happy to help facilitate those conversations, and we look forward to sharing with you more future webinars on topics around advanced management and leadership in the future. And all that remains is for me to wish you a very pleasant rest of the week and afternoon, and thank you very much for being with us here in Oxford today. Goodbye.